In this demonstration, we're going to have a comprehensive look at the integration between Visual Studio and SharePoint. First of all, notice that we can create a new project based on an installed template of type SharePoint 2010. And within that group, we have a number of different template types, such as empty or visual web part or workflow and so forth. We can also choose the .NET Framework version as well of 3.5. So let's start off with an empty SharePoint project called Product Marketing. Now, Visual Studio is aware that we have created a SharePoint project and allows us to validate the URL that we will use for testing and deployment to a local SharePoint server. When all of that is completed successfully, we click Finish and create the project. So we have our empty SharePoint project and we can add new items. Because we chose a SharePoint type to start with, we can very easily add specific project item types. In this case, I will add a list definition. We will call that Product Marketing Tasks and click Add. This is really a definition of tasks that will be deployed up to our SharePoint server when we deploy our solution from Visual Studio. We can choose a task or list type if you like, and notice that we could also create a list instance. So I've done exactly that. We have our Product Marketing Tasks definition and a list instance for that type of task called List Instance 1. Now first of all, let's deal with the list definition. We can change some of its attributes simply in the XML markup here. We can say, do not show the definition on the quick launch bar and do not allow deletion of lists based on this list definition. We might also say versioning is enabled for items in lists that are based on this list definition, and so on. There's a whole host of attributes that we can apply, such as hidden, if we wanted to create hidden lists, and so on. There are many different attributes, so disabling attachments is also something we could do for this definition. Let's have a look at the list schema. The schema defines the columns, so we have a number of columns created for us by default because we chose a base type of tasks. But we can very easily add additional columns or remove existing ones from that schema XML file. Now let's also take a look at the instance. The first thing I want to do is rename it, so we can give it a suitable name for Product Marketing Tasks. Let's call it Product Tasks. And the list instance has its own elements XML file. So these are the settings for this specific instance, not the definition. So we could change its description or specify that it's on the quick launch bar. We could say that versioning is enabled for this particular instance, and so on. So let's just say that the versioning is enabled. We could then save the file and close it. Now we have features within the Visual Studio Solution Explorer, so let's take a brief look at that. Because we have created the list definition and list instance, Visual Studio has assumed that we want them to be packaged together as a feature, and indeed we do. Now what we will do is add additional items to that feature, so we will create an event receiver, and our event receiver will fire when the user performs some action on the list instances in that list that we have just defined. So let's choose list events, and we can see all of the following events that we can create receivers for. So we can say a field was added, for example, or the list was deleted. But let's stick with the field was added for the time being. And Visual Studio creates our class that is an event receiver. In fact, it's a class that inherits from SPList event receiver and provides our override for field added, which is the actual event. So we can now start working with the data that gets passed into the event receiver. We can define an SP field type object. We'll call it new field. And we have access to that via the properties parameter that gets passed into the event. So we can specify that SP field is equal to this field property. We can then start working with items such as GUID to build a field ID and have that retrieved for us from the fields that got added to the list. We can then start making some decisions about what we want to do with this new field that got added by the user. So we can check its type, and we have an enumerated type there that the object model provides for us. So we were saying if it's a textual type, well, what we might want to do is go to all of the existing list items in the list that won't currently have a value for this field because it's just been added. And what we could do is perhaps update the values there to remind the information worker to provide suitable values at some point. So we can access the actual list now through the properties. So we have splist this list equals properties.list. And we can iterate through the list items in the list item collection of this list. So very simple code, simply for each splist item in this list.items. Now we know that we have access to the GUID for the field that got added because we've just retrieved that in the second line of code in the event receiver. So we can actually set the values of that field now. So we will say something like, please update this field or this existing item. Now when we have set a field value for the list item, we always need to call the update method, and that commits the change to the SharePoint list. It's very simple code, but we are starting to work with the object model now in a bit more depth, and this is a good example of an event receiver. Now notice we can create additional event receivers in the same class. So although I only chose one event receiver in the wizard, we could override additional methods to hook into additional events. So in this case we override the list deleting event, and we can do something like cancel the event if we need to, so we can prevent deletion of a list this way. We say properties.cancel equals true, and that stops this event from continuing, which in effect will stop the list from being deleted. Now notice the event is called list deleting, and that's known as a pre-event, and that's why we can cancel it, because the event actually hasn't completed yet. The first event that we created was a post event, and that was called field added. So we wouldn't have been able to cancel that event, but there is of course a corresponding field adding event. If we wanted to prevent a user from adding a field to the list, we could cancel that type of event. Now let's take a look at our feature. Visual Studio has actually added the event receiver to the feature, so now we have three items: the list instance, the list definition, and the event receiver. Now if that was not appropriate, you could of course remove one of these items from the feature package and put it into a new feature, and Visual Studio would deploy them as separate features or separate entities. Now let's add another new item. We will add a web part, and we will call our web part Product Tasks Viewer. We have seen web parts in the previous module, and of course what you might do is build a UI that renders list items from the product task list that we are deploying. Now Visual Studio has actually put the web part into its own feature, because it guesses that it wasn't necessarily related to our list definition, list instances and event receiver. But we can change that behaviour by saying, let's remove it from feature 2 and add it into feature 1. So now we have 4 items that are logically related as far as we are concerned as a developer, and we can ensure they get deployed and activated as a feature by SharePoint. Now let's add one more new item, which is another event receiver. We will call it Product Marketing Web Events. So with web events we can hook into events such as the site was provisioned or the site is being provisioned and so forth. These are events that are not associated with any list or any specific list instance. So what we can do in a very similar way to which we worked with the list event receiver is access the properties of the new web that was provisioned, again through a parameter called property. So this time we can instantiate an spweb object and set it equal to the web property of the properties object, and then we can start working with that web object. So for example we can say allow unsafe updates, and all that really means is that we are allowed to set properties of a web through the web browser. So then we can do things like set its title to anything that we want. And we'll make this a fairly explicit example, and we will say updated in code. And then once we have set a property of the spweb object, we must call update to have that change committed. Just a bit of housekeeping. We should then turn off allow unsafe updates. So now Visual Studio has added our new event receiver to feature 2, and that was initially created for the web part. So now we can go ahead and add a new project, and in this case we will add a class library. So this is actually a non-SharePoint asset to start with, and we will just call it Marketing Site Util, because it's going to contain a little helper function. And it just has a class, so we can rename the class to something more appropriate for our purposes. So I'll call it util. So let's make a public string method called setSiteTitle. And very simply we are just going to return a static piece of text from this method call, and the aim I should say is that at some point we want to deploy the class library, this DLL, so that our existing SharePoint solution can make use of it. So that's all we're doing. We're going to return a string called marketing subsite. Let's take a look at the build properties. We will assign it because we may deploy this to the global assembly cache, and then we can use the same strong name key that Visual Studio created for our previous product, Marketing Project. So that suits us just fine. What we can now do is build the entire solution. Now we also want to use the DLL in our class library. So let's put a reference into that other project, and we will use the marketing util to provide the text for our new site. Let's declare an object variable of type marketingsiteutil.util, and that's going to return the static piece of string. But you can imagine that you are doing something a little bit more complex than that in your DLL. Now then we can declare a string for sTitle and set that equal to the return of the method setSiteTitle that we have just created. Then we can use that instead of our static string here in our product marketing event receiver to use the value returned from that DLL. So let's save the entire solution and we can build it, make sure we have no build errors. What we can then do is look at the packaging designer. We have had a look at that in the feature designer already, but the packaging designer allows us to group multiple features together and really defines the structure of the WSP, or Windows SharePoint Solution Package. What we can now do is add the DLL that we created, even though it is a non-SharePoint asset to start with. We can add that on the Advanced tab and we can deploy it to the Global Assembly cache or the web application. And now we can save again and build the entire solution and then deploy it. So let's go ahead and hit deploy. Visual Studio will deploy our package, which includes our 2 features and also our DLL so that it's accessible by the web application. So let's test out our functionality now. We'll browse to intranet.contoso.com, which was the site we chose when we created the project as our test and debugging site. And we have our list instance on the quick launch bar, so product marketing, product tasks. We can then create some new items and a new dialog platform appears that allows us as an information worker to very quickly add new items to the list. And so we'll create a task called Prepare Product Portfolio and set its due date, and all of the fields were defined in the list definition upon which we based this list instance. Remember, we chose that very easily by choosing the general tasks list as a template to start with. Let's go into the list settings and we can see the columns that have been created for our list. Now we have an event receiver that fires when we add a new column of type text. So let's go ahead and do one of those and watch our event receiver fire. So we have chosen a text type, and when we click OK, we have our new column. Let's go back to the list, and there's our new column, and the new text in the event receiver has been added. So even if there were 100 or 1,000 list items, each item would be updated with that text, which reminds the user to update these items. Let's create a new list based on that list instance, so we can have multiple lists that have these same columns. So we'll create a new list called Product Launch Tasks. So there again we have another new list on that same list definition. Let's have a look at the list settings for this list. We can see all of the columns there are already defined.